Ecosystem after system is plundered and laid to waste as from the earth he sucks the life. Secret vital organs from the living.
So good morning, everybody in the room and on Zoom. Welcome to this opportunity of a conversation with a number of people, because I think we'll have some conversation in the room as well, but with JohnSeed and Tejopala Rawls. And I would like to just start with taking a few moments, one, to acknowledge that we are meeting on Indigenous country, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present. And I would like to give thanks for the example that they give of caring for country, of being in a custodial right relationship with country. And I thank them for that example, which is a unique and precious gift that they share with everyone on this country. And that is a very special thing. This is kind of a conversation that came about because I knew that JohnSeed was coming to Melbourne and would be in Melbourne between two weekend workshops. And I just started saying to people, would you like to have a conversation with John? He's in Melbourne, we could have something. And I actually met Tejopala outside, in an action outside Peter Carlil, who is my local federal member. We were having a climate action out of front of his office, and I said to Tejopala, do you know JohnSeed? He's coming to Melbourne. Would you be interested in the conversation? And from that's how this morning's conversation came. So it is a little bit of a hybrid, let's have a chat, let's have a presentation talk. So it's an emerging process. I'm not entirely sure how this morning is going to come. So please, so it's an opportunity to experience something new and fresh. So, and because it has a Buddhist flavour, I invite us to just sit for a minute. We will have a minute, and I've got my bell, and we will just take a moment to come to this place wherever it is that you are, and we'll sit for a minute. As a part of, we're a bit constrained with the technology that we have to include people on the Zoom. So we're going to do the passing the computer around a little bit. Can I just have a sound check from the people? Can people hear me okay talking? Yes, I can see some thumbs, that's good. So I would, starting maybe with one of our conversationalists this morning, JohnSeed, who is quite a renowned activist and long-time campaigner and eco-dharmist in many ways. And so I will pass over to John for just some introduce himself and some opening remarks.
Thanks, Pauline. Thanks, everyone, for being here. So I thought this morning that one lens on most of my life could be the interweaving of Dharma and deep ecology. And so perhaps I'll just do an extended introduction from that point of view. So more than 50 years ago, in 1973, I left my job as a systems engineer for IBM in the financial district of London and hit the road, travelling overland back to Australia, which I'd left 5 years earlier. And en route with my partner, we ran into Buddhism first in Nepal in the form of Lama Zopa and Lama Yeshe, where we did a month-long retreat. And then soon after at Bodh Gaya in India, where we did a 10-day Vipassana retreat with Goenkaji. And when that was over, we were determined that upon returning to Australia, we would find a community of Buddhists, that we would organise meditation retreats, that we would spend our lives in this way. And coming back to Sydney, the only Buddhism that I could find in Australia at that time was at the Chinese Buddhist Society in Dixon Street. A Thai monk called Prakantipalo was giving a half-hour session on Sunday mornings, I think. And we moved up to Nimbin in northern New South Wales and settled in with the hippies up there and started organising retreats for Prakantipalo. I think we organised 4 or 5 meditation retreats up there. And in the course of that, we found some land to build a meditation centre, half an hour east of Nimbin at the Channon. We built the Forest Meditation Centre, donated by a community called Dharmananda. And there's someone in the waiting room. The first retreats that we organised at the Forest Meditation Centre were run by a man that many of you will know as Christopher Titmuss, but at that time he was still wearing Thai robes, and his name was Lumpi. And so once again, we organised a number of retreats for Lumpi, and out of those retreats, 20 of us each agreed to find $1,000 in order to buy shares in a piece of land nearby so that we could become caretakers of the meditation centre. And this land we called Bodhi Farm, and we grew our own vegetables, built our own houses illegally, and organised meditation retreats. And I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life like that when mysteriously, a few years later, in August of 1979, I found myself somehow embroiled in what years later we would realise was the first direct action in defence of rainforests, not only in Australia, but as far as we know, anywhere in the world. And I was just there because a neighbour had appealed for help at the local produce market, saying the forestry were coming in the next day to log the end of Terania Creek Road. So I'd never been to the end of Terania Creek Road. I didn't know there was a rainforest there. I didn't know what a rainforest was, but I wanted to be neighbourly and showed up, and something happened to me there that changed everything. My whole life spun around, and I lost interest in what I'd been doing up until then, and basically ran away with the Ecology circus and became a full-time activist. Started the Rainforest Information Centre once I'd understood the importance of rainforests, and to find out what was happening all around the world, and to try to see if there was anything that we could do. Those first actions were hugely successful. I think now that the society had yet to develop any antibodies to the kinds of theatrical hijinks of people climbing up into trees and chaining themselves to machinery, so that it was possible to be the first item on the news night after night after night. And but, you know, partly it was that, and partly clearly the times were changing, because in less than 2 years from a standing start, because nobody knew that there were rainforests in Australia. It wasn't even called rainforest. Up around the north coast of New South Wales, it was known as the bastard scrub, and there was nothing romantic about it. It was full of thorns and leeches, and it was dank and miserable. But so the whole idea of the you know, beauty of rainforest and the importance of rainforest grew out of those actions. Anyway, less than 2 years after that standing start, an opinion poll found that more than 70% of the people of New South Wales wanted an end to rainforest logging, and the government of the day responded with a string of national parks that stretched from the Border Ranges down to Barrington Tops, and included the Nightcap National Park, where the end of Terania Creek Road was, that where we'd been doing our theatre and getting arrested. So from there, the best of the subtropical rainforests were protected. We were invited down to Tasmania by a group that was then known as the Tasmanian Wilderness Society, run by a dole bludger called Bob Brown, and we were now the world's experts in rainforest actions, and so we were invited to help set up the base camp at Strawn to protect the temperate rainforests from the damming of the Franklin River. That was the biggest such action in Australian history. More than 3,000 people came from all over the country. More than 1,500 were arrested. And once again, that dam was stopped, and a national park was there instead. And 2 years after that, I guess 60 of us from around Nimbin and the Channon went up to the Daintree for the tropical rainforests, and to stop the real estate development that was being planned for up there. And in each case, national parks and eventual World Heritage listing rewarded our efforts. But at the same time, it was becoming clear that worldwide, for every forest protected in the first half of the 1980s, 1,000 forests had been lost. And clearly there was no way to save the planet one forest at a time. That unless we could address the underlying spiritual disease that allows modern humans to imagine that we can profit from the destruction of our own life support systems, clearly these actions would be of no particular consequence as far as the future of the world was concerned. And it was these thoughts that led me to deep ecology. So the term deep ecology was coined by the late Arnie Ness, who was Professor of Philosophy from Oslo University. And according to him, underlying all of the symptoms of the environmental crisis lay the illusion of separation between human beings and the rest of the natural world, the illusion of separation. And this illusion was itself a result of anthropocentrism, or human-centeredness, the idea that human beings are the center of everything. So we humans are the crown of creation, the measure of all being, and the world consists of human beings on the one hand and resources for human beings on the other. Nothing has any intrinsic value except humans. Other things may just have instrumental value if they are of service to us. The earth itself has no value until we turn it into something. It's just dirt until we, add our labor or intelligence and turn it into a product of some kind. And Arnie Ness said that this fallacy of anthropocentrism was so deeply rooted in our cultural history, stretching back at least as far as the Old Testament, where we learn that man is to subdue and dominate nature, and nature is to be in fear and trembling of us, that we can't think our way out of the mess that's created. He said that ecological ideas won't save us. What's needed is ecological identity, or ecological self. And he called for community therapies to heal that illusion of separation. In in 1986, I met my teacher, Joanna Macy, and she had the missing link between the ideas of deep ecology, which, as Arnie Ness pointed out, weren't sufficient, and these community therapies, which we went on to begin to create. The first of them we called the Council of All Beings, and we wrote a book with Arnie Ness and Pat Fleming called Thinking Like a Mountain Towards a Council of All Beings, and have been conducting experiential deep ecology workshops since then. I had one last weekend, as Pauline mentioned, and another one coming up this coming weekend. So meanwhile, Buddhism had all but disappeared, but in the mid-80s, I got a call from Wes Nisker, who was the editor of Inquiring Mind, which is the Vipassana magazine in the United States, and he said, can we do an interview? And I said, look, I'm afraid that I haven't meditated for years and I don't think I'm a Buddhist anymore. And he said, of course you're a Buddhist, and that was when I realized that, maybe being a Buddhist wasn't just what I had thought, and this whole school of engaged Buddhism was moving into the foreground. And I found myself moving back into, especially because I had seen that, whereas I had had a kind of a spiritual epiphany at Terania Creek, where the wild earth itself became the source of all of my spiritual connection. For most people, this, it would be important to nourish the growing shoots of ecological consciousness within existing spiritual traditions, because each tradition, including Buddhism, has many such possibilities. And so I got involved in Christianity and Buddhism and Hinduism and Judaism to try to find those growing shoots and find ways to nourish those growing shoots. One of the pieces of that was something that we call the Dharma Gaia Trust, which was Dharma is the Buddha Dharma, Gaia is the goddess of earth. And this was a project where we found projects in India and other Asian countries, usually Buddhist clergy, where Buddhist clergy were trying to do something environmental, and we would do fundraising and awareness raising in America and Australia and Europe to raise funds for those. So, for example, in Thailand, some forest monks were ordaining the trees in order to stop the logging. They would find old growth trees, tie an orange cloth around the tree, do the appropriate ceremony, and the woodcutters would leave those trees alone. And so we made sure they never ran out of orange cloth. And in fact, in the end, the king stood behind them and ordered tree ordination for everyone to do that on, I think it was the 60th anniversary of his coronation, and millions of trees were ordained. You can still see bits of rags around trees around Thailand as a result. And then I began to do workshops bringing Buddhism and deep ecology together. We called the workshops Buddha Touched the Earth, and I would facilitate alongside a Vipassana teacher or a Zen teacher, Susan Murphy, and different teachers, where we'd spend the morning in meditation, and in the afternoon we'd be doing the deep ecology work. Buddha Touched the Earth referred to a famous moment in the story of the Buddha, where many pictures and statues exist of the Buddha with his hand touching the earth, and telling of the time just before the Buddha's enlightenment, when he was being assailed yet again by Mara, and Mara was saying, by whose authority do you claim this so-called enlightenment? And Buddha touched the earth, and the earth roared her assent. The earth claimed the Buddha as her own. And so okay, that'll do for me. Thanks so much. And I'll hand it over to Tejopala.
Wow. It's quite interesting experience trying to do both an in-person. We've got about, for those of you who can't see, we've got about 10 people here, plus myself and John. In where we're sitting is it's called the Catalyst Social Centre, I think it's called. Sort of an anarchist socialist place in Coburg, which is sort of, you know, what you'd expect in Coburg, for those of you who know Melbourne. So I'm trying to divide my attention a bit between the fact that I'm actually sitting next to JohnSeed, who's a name I've heard for a long time, and 10 other people, a couple of whom I actually know, and then a number of you online. My name's Tejopala. At the moment, I work as an organiser for the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change, which is Australia's only multi-faith grassroots climate organisation. And I've been working for them for about 7 years. It's great to have you here, Christina. There's a woman here, Christina, with whom I was on she came up to an arrestable action that up in central Queensland, trying to stop the Adani coal mine. We were there together. It's just really good to have people who've done that kind of thing with you. I first got involved in both environmental activism and Buddhism at about the same time. Slightly different trajectory from yours, John. I grew up in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and was a teenager in the 1980s. And I would see New Zealand became a nuclear-free zone at that point. And it was, I remember watching some of the media that was coming up and some of the spokespeople and sort of thinking, I could do a better job than you as sort of a 15-year-old. And then sort of I probably couldn't have, but you know, there was a reflex in me, I think, at that point. But then, more seriously, by 1995, the French government announced a series of nuclear tests at Mororoa Atoll, which was to be their last series of tests. They announced a series of 8 nuclear tests. And a group of us got together in the Peace and Environment Centre in Wellington. And the guy there called Nicky Hager, who's sort of an absolute legend of the New Zealand peace movement, said, well, who's going to organise some media response to this? And there was myself and one other person, both in our sort of, I was 24, I think. In our 20s, Louise May and I just said, oh, yeah, we'll do that. Interestingly, I didn't kind of clock it at the time, but she was another person with a faith background. I was about to become interested in Buddhism. She was a Catholic and went on to work for Caritas. And so we just organised some pretty large protests. And within 6 days, I was suddenly fronting national media and kind of going, I guess I'd better get good at this stuff. But by 95, at the end of that process, I was very stressed out. And my brother had done some retreats with the same Buddhist teacher you mentioned, S.N. Goenka. And so he said, why don't you do one of their retreats as a way of decompressing? Now, I don't know if anyone's there familiar with teachings of S.N. Goenka. It's not a light way to decompress. He throws you into 10 days of meditating for 10 hours a day. So you rack up your first 100 hours pretty quickly, starting at 4:30 in the morning, I think, 4 or 4:30, something like that, early. So it's very intense, all in silence. And sort of got interested in Buddhism from there. I mean, a year later, I got involved in what was then called the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, which is now called the Triratna Buddhist Community. And the main teacher there was a man called Urgyen Sangharakshita. And so I kind of got schooled in that tradition, which is an attempt at an ecumenical approach to all of Buddhism, and ended up getting quite confused because an awful lot of the other people in that particular Buddhist community, most of them sort of saw environmental concerns as, you know, a good thing, but sort of a distraction from core Buddhist practice and teaching, which is not an uncommon thing in any tradition. You'll get that in all sorts of religious traditions. You know, that's all very well, but it's not, you know, it's not going to get you into the kingdom of heaven. Is another version of the same thing. And meanwhile, the other thing that happened in 1996, I met someone who went on to be a very good friend of mine, Roland Sapsford, who was the campaign manager for the Green Party over there, the party equivalent to the party president, the co-convener at different times. But Roland got me aware of the climate issue for the first time. So I kind of really encountered Buddhism and the climate, what I see as the truth of the Buddhist teaching and the reality of the climate situation at the same time in 1996, more or less. And I couldn't leave either of them alone. And I had this very, very long path to try and make sense of those in a community of people where only some of the people seem to see the connection. And have sort of worked it out on my own a bit. Since those times, I mean, our Buddhist community's changed enormously. I'm proud to say I've helped set up what we call the Tree Ratna Earth Sangha, which is a network of people in our worldwide community in lots of countries who are concerned about the climate and trying to get active on it in various ways, not just the normal changing your light bulb stuff. But yeah, so for the last 7 years, there's a lot in between. More recently, had 2 children. But 18 years ago, I was ordained in that tradition. So yeah, it's a fascinating area. There's an awful lot it's probably hard for me to say very much. I'm going to rely on Pauline to ask a few questions that will kind of hopefully elicit some better reflections on what I see as the connections between, and I'm aware that there's someone else here next to me who's been doing it a generation longer than I have. I could literally say, well, yeah, we helped set up Bob Brown's base camp. So I feel like I sort of feel like I'd sort of mostly here in a support role, but that's a little bit about where I'm from. I've realized more recently that my instincts are largely informed by having grown up in New Zealand rather than Australia. The peace movement in New Zealand is stronger, I think, there. And a lot of my sort of political instincts are more bound up in the sort of hippie peace movement background rather than a sort of, a polarized ex-trade union background or something like that. Although I think we've got a lot to learn in New Zealand about having stronger trade unions as well. So yeah, much to say there. I'm curious about, we've got someone coming in. I'm curious about the people who are here. I guess that would help me get a bit of a read on what to say. I'm curious about, who would mostly consider themselves as coming from an activist background, more or less, and who would more or less think, well, maybe I've got a toe in that water, but I'm primarily coming into this from some kind of faith background or a spiritual path of some kind. Obviously I'm here to say that they're not separate, but yes, I'm mostly interested to know, where people are coming from, because it'll help me kind of gauge my responses. And I wonder if it might help you as well. So just if I could get an awful lot of people on the screen have your cameras off, so it's not easy to see that. But if I could get a quick, maybe this version, this is what I tend to do in the meetings I facilitate, hands sort of up the screen or down the screen. If you kind of identify not very much with having a faith or spiritual background, put them down here. And if you identify with it, actually, very definitely, I have some background in that area up here. That would be helpful. There's a lot of people here. Someone I happen to know is a strong Catholic with their hands about there. Okay, and what about activism? Where would you kind of put yourself in terms of climate or environmental activism? Somewhere down here or up here? Again, sort of a range. Oh, that's useful. Thank you. There's quite a lot of people with a fair bit of both, is what I saw just there. So maybe if you want to start prodding us with helpful questions, Pauline, and we might take it from there.
So one of the conversations kind of started when we were throwing around how this might unfold. We were talking about the connection between the inner work that we do and the outer work that we do. So, and I'm kind of interested that it's a kind of a polarity right there, and I would therefore argue that it's actually the same thing and not necessarily separate, but how are they interrelated? So I'm really curious, and to sort of get some little nuggets maybe on that interplay of the inner work and how that plays out in the outer, how that might support the outer, and how the outer, well, like, what's the rest of that current? I guess would be a question I am interested in.
Well, my take on this is probably, it's always just an approximation, but I think the core Buddhist teaching is what's sometimes called conditionality or conditioned co-production. It's called a number of different things. The original Pali or Sanskrit was pratichyat samappada. It's essentially saying that all things arise in dependence on conditions, and in the absence of those conditions, they cease to be. Now, it sounds incredibly dry and a bit abstract, but it's essentially saying nothing is its own cause. Everything has a multiplicity of other causes which all relate to one another. So all things are, first of all, not only profoundly interconnected, but have no actual separate being, ultimately. The idea that we can perceive the world as made up of static things, or oneself as a static thing, is a complete mistake. And that plays out on lots of different levels. And I guess the other core Buddhist teaching is the centrality of what tends to be called the mind. And if you read one of the most famous Buddhist texts, the Dhammapada, it starts off with verses that tell you that everything good or bad follows from the state of mind out of which you're acting. If you're acting with a skillful, kind, and compassionate state of mind, positive things will follow, and the converse is also true. And so if you reflect on those things, what that says to me is that what I call my state of mind, my state of mind, is actually informed by a whole set of a web of conditions around me. If I'm in a stressed out world, if I'm in a world where we've got until the next, I don't know, somewhere between it's too late and 2030, I think is the latest version, to sort out the climate crisis, then that has an effect on my state of mind. By the same token, if I act with kindness and awareness and of others, including not just human beings, and I'm aware of the state of mind that I'm acting out of sufficiently to be able to have some say on, then that will have an effect in the world for better or for worse. And that flow ultimately is that you can make distinctions, but they're not separate. So yeah, that's the shortest version I can muster. And I guess that's an incredibly abstract way of putting it, really. In order to really get that, I think, listening to some of what you've recorded in the past, John, in order to really get that, a lot of what needs to happen is an emotional shift. The Buddhist tradition and lots of religious traditions talk about the difference between getting things intellectually, which Buddhism sees as kind of a fairly shallow level of mind concept, and an emotional engagement that actually shifts. There's all sorts of people. St. Paul wrote about that. The Buddha spoke about that in terms of what he called right emotion. I think that the example that moves me the most, and then I'll hand to you, is actually completely non-Buddhist. It's actually from the Catholic world. I saw this interview with Christine, you might know his name, the American scientist who first told the Pope Francis, about the climate crisis.
It was in Argentina.
Was he Argentinian? He's an Argentinian priest, but he's also a scientist, climate scientist. And he I saw this interview with him, and this is before the famous papal encyclical Laudato Si came in 2015, and probably not long after Pope Francis had become the Pope. And he rehearsed what he was going to say to the Pope. He knew he had a shot talking to him about the climate crisis, and he rehearsed what he was going to say, and he had it all ready to go in Spanish. And as it turned out, the day that he was actually had the chance to speak to him, he was told at the last second, "You've got the space between this side of the Vatican car park and the other one to make your pitch." So, talk about an elevator pitch, right? And he said he'd got all the science and all the rational arguments, everything worked out, and he was going to say it all in Spanish. And then English must have been somewhat more comfortable for him, because he said he just broke into English, and all he said was, "This will affect the poor." Now, a lot followed from that. And yeah, the Catholic Church has got all sorts of good and bad bits in it when it comes to the climate crisis, but there's some very, very good bits. And, I know of cardinals and archbishops, and especially nuns, who've spoken out very strongly and organized quite comprehensively. So, I think that's a really good example of how emotions, if you're trying to kind of act in solidarity and you actually get some real sense of a non-separateness between yourself and others, then it's the heart that has to change. With that, shut up.
Wow, that was beautiful. Thank you. Very moving. So, when you spoke about inner and outer, the first thing that came to me was recognizing that without those years of sitting with sore knees and wondering what the hell I was doing here, there's no way that the person that I was as a systems engineer at IBM would have been able to find myself with the opportunity that I found myself with, that things are connected in that way. And then I thought about how I, especially in the early days, how I used to find the direction for my work, so much to do and so many possibilities. And I would remember that as well as being JohnSeed with this particular biographical information, every cell in my body was descended in an unbroken chain from the first cell of life on Earth, that every breath that I breathed was receiving gases that were being created by the green things around me. I just would bring to mind all of those connections. And sometimes I'd remember that I was just one leaf on the tree of life, and that what happened to the tree utterly impacted me, that there could be no separation. And then I would perhaps bury myself in leaves if it was dry, and I would just sink into the ground, and I would think, send me direction, send me guidance. And then I'd get up and dust myself off, and then whatever I felt like doing after that, I took that to be my orders. Like whatever enthusiasm emerged after that, I didn't try and create it intellectually. So I'm not quite sure how this speaks to this question, but just somehow that I guess another piece is that in the ceremonies that we practice in the experiential deep ecology weekends in order to nourish our ecological identity, one of them is based on the work of a famous Catholic theologian, the late Father Thomas Berry, who spoke about the universe itself as being the primary source of everything, of course, but that he spoke about us modern humans and the understandings that were emerging through empiricism, through science, that he said that it's the universe itself becoming conscious in the human, becoming conscious of itself, that we humans are that moment when the universe, perhaps for the first time for all we know, is able to recognize itself in a certain kind of a way and look back at the trail that it's trod for 13.7 billion years through all of the tales of the evolution of life on Earth at the moment, and correctly understood, the jaw of the universe drops in awe and astonishment. And one of his colleagues, a nun, Sister Miriam Therese McGillis, created a ceremony that allows that to be turned into an experience that, as she called, the cosmic walk. And we practice the cosmic walk, and we practice inviting that level of identity which is cosmic, which is universal. And it feels authentic that people, in sharing afterwards, after that practice, people share the experience of tremendous relief from the anguish of all the polycrises that we face, to recognize that there is some level of our identity which moth and rust will not corrupt, and that is, that all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well. And that's a really important piece, because we can then return to our incarnation as threatened mammals in 2024 with a vengeance, and knowing that however exhausted or depressed or terrified we become, there is we know how to get back to that place of safety. So I don't know how that speaks to your question, Pauline, but that's what came up for me when you asked.
So one of the things, I guess, that in my mind that came up then was the Brian Swim, who wrote about Thomas Berry in the book The Universe is a Green Dragon. Great book. Everyone should read that. And he's just put out something else recently, another book. And in talking about that, Brian Swim was talking about how important it is for that cosmic perspective that our minds be boggled. That as humans in the late 21st century, that we can be a little bit inclined to think that we actually we know all of the things, and we know it's like this, or we know it's like that, even though those, there's quite large groups of people that definitely know completely different things. But that process of the cosmic walk is that it's literally mind-boggling, and it puts you into that space of not knowing, of like, oh man, I don't know anything. And in that kind of beginner mind space, then we can be much more in that emotional, it kicks us out of our heads and into something else much more experiential. And that Brian Swim really says that it's important to be boggled. It's important to be kicked out of that rut in which we are convinced that we know everything. And at the weekend, we were talking to some, around the fire, and some of the people were talking about how they used to be very optimistic about, like, oh yes, we can find out the science and we'll just let people know about the science of climate change, and then obviously people will change. And now, 30, 40 years later, that particular person was like, oh, I'm really pessimistic, because we've been knowing the science for a very long time, and where is that shift happening? Why haven't we done it yet? And so I would invite your thoughts, both of you, on the importance of holding that spaciousness of stepping out of into the beginner mind, I guess. And it's a little bit, maybe you're saying, when you said, John, about you just go and you lie on the earth, and then the next thing, like whatever takes you, but to the importance of that unknowing and stepping out of that human conceit that we actually do know everything. Would you like to riff a bit on that, either of you?
Gosh, where to start? Yeah, there's a very famous Tibetan Buddhist teacher from about 1,000 years ago called Padmasambhava, and this is certainly, and there's lots of other faith traditions that have got their own things to say about this, but who's talked about the whole thing of not knowing. And he said, I think the words were something like that you should continuously repeat to yourself the words, I do not know, I do not have, I do not understand. I do not know, I do not have, I do not understand, as an attempt to break out of just assuming that you do. I mean, there's lots of other ways. I think aesthetic experiences can take you out of yourself in a helpful way. Direct artistic experiences, nature, all sorts of things can, but it's important to find a way out of that. I mean, at the moment, we really have the mother of all I do not know. I mean, if anyone ever says to me, so is it too late for the climate? I kind of go, I actually don't know. You know, like the range of scientific opinion is everywhere from Rupert Reed with, you know, it's all way too late, through to Michael Mann saying, you know, absolutely it's not, and just get on with it. And I think we've entered the grey zone. And I guess I've heard something of what you reported in a previous interview, John, about, you know, the importance of acknowledging feelings. I mean, acknowledging the fear, acknowledging the sense of despair that can come up. I sort of, if you don't mind me saying, I agree with some of that, but I'm also curious about the fact that you place that in a sequence which starts with gratitude and ends with gratitude, which is a very, very positive emotion. And I don't think acknowledging those feelings can take place unless you've got a basis of positive emotion of some kind. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition, for what it's worth, says that, I mean, people talk about optimism and pessimism. I think the Tibetans have got it right, which is they say what you need is compassion. And they certainly don't have the monopoly on compassion, but what their emphasis is, look, compassion has what they call its far enemy and its near enemies. A state of mind that is its obvious opposite. The far enemy is hatred. But it has two, what they call near enemies, that kind of look and feel like compassion at first glance, but really are not. And those are one is sentimental pity, and the other one is horrified, overwhelmed anxiety. And I think that second one, horrified, overwhelmed anxiety, is where most of us in the climate movement are most of the time. And it's an occupational hazard. Sometimes I read an IPCC report and I just go, I'm going to need half a day before I do it. But what I see as the state of mind out of which I can act with strength and act with some hopeful compassion with others is cultivating deliberately through meditation and other things, mostly through being around other people, is cultivating a state of mind of compassion. And that sits in a sequence of 4 practices known in the Buddhist world as Brahma Viharas, the sublime abodes, which is developing loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And equanimity sounds like a bit of a stretch right now. The closest I've managed to get to that is bearing in mind the Buddha's main teaching, which is that, look, our suffering is caused by a sense of being a separate self. And everyone is trapped in that, including the people who are rapidly destroying the ecosystems on which we live. And it's very hard to bear that in mind, that these people are actually causing their own suffering. And, you know, if you take the question of karma seriously, and I do, are going to have some pretty serious karmic consequences at some point, if not right now. And I've got that wrong before now. I've sat in, my first week in the job, had a meeting I had with Josh Frydenberg when he was the Minister for the Environment, talking about the Adani coal mine. Literally, it was like at the beginning of a stand-up routine, because I was literally with a bishop and a rabbi and a nun, and it's me. and we're sitting there I was just getting more and more angry with him inside, and and had a similar experience a year or two later, when, believe it or not, we got an invitation. Our organisation got an invitation to meet with the executive team of Adani Australia, and we had 2 hours. And I was myself, my boss, Thea Ormerod, is amazing, amazing Catholic one, and the Dean of St John's Anglican Cathedral in Brisbane, Peter Catt, and we're sitting opposite 5 people who are the top brass at Dharma Australia. And that day I felt like I'd succeeded as an activist, but utterly failed as a Buddhist practitioner. Because it was, the rage in me was just beyond off the scale. And it took a couple of years before I could reflect on those people and think they are caught up in what Buddhism calls samsara, cyclic, reactive, egoistic existence. And I think some sort of reflection on that, plus loving kindness and compassion meditation, can bring some level of equanimity. I hope that helps.
Wow. So in terms of equanimity, I think about Brian Swim, who you mentioned, worked with Thomas Berry. One of the things that he said that I like a lot was that he said, the earth used to be nothing but lava, and now it sings opera. And so nothing has been added. There has been no intervention from the outside. There is something about that lava which includes the propensity, even the desire perhaps, to sing opera. And should it be that it all turns back to lava again, it's that lava, And so to be a I loved Leonard Cohen. One of his songs, he said, the realization that he's a brief elaboration of a tube. This tube from the mouth to the anus is a brief elaboration of a tube. So it's not just personally, but as a species, as life on Earth, all of that, nothing is permanent. All of those things will disappear. If I get a vote, I want another million years. I want another billion years. I haven't had enough by a long shot, But the worst case scenario is that this utterly incredible universe has destinies that are completely out of our, there's no way that we can know. There's no way that we can know what is, what happens next, what's supposed to happen next. And, so coming back from there to this question of feelings, which I think is really important for a number of reasons. And this is, all of this I learned from my teacher, Joanna Macy, who's now 95 years old and continuing to, blossom. That she showed me that we live in a culture where there is a denial of a really important part of our humanity, which are these feelings, the bad feelings that we are never invited to share, that we are afraid to feel, the terror, the rage, the anguish, the despair, the horror, all of these things. But Joanna said that the fear of these feelings is part of the engine that's driving the destruction around us, that we are descended from 4,000 million years of successful ancestors, that every single one of us, every single one of our ancestors has been intelligent enough to reach the age of reproducing itself before it was consumed, without exception. And that means that they passed through every one of the previous extinction spasms, including the end of the Permian era, when 95% of all of the species of that time were extinguished, and everything that we know and love blossomed out of the remaining 5%, and our ancestors were among them. So that while agreeing with you entirely about being completely nonplussed and unknowing and having not a clue how this is going to go, not feeling in the least optimistic, but neither pessimistic. It's like neither of those things seem to be of much use. What is of use is that because I have the opportunity to facilitate these circles where Joanna moves, as you say, from gratitude to honouring our pain for the world, where we create a safe container and invite these normally forbidden feelings, the ones that have been banished to the hell realms. But it's these feelings that were actually the intelligence that allowed our ancestors to succeed. That in those 4,000 million years, how long has it been that we've grown this bulge over our nose and started to think our way into the decisions that we made? All of those ancestors made good decisions, and these were selected for in every generation. That a single generation where the feelings were less accurate of understanding where danger lay and where safety lay and these things, and any time that the passion to continue, the passion to survive, the passion to move, for life to continue, where this subsided, these ones, didn't have babies that had babies. And so by inviting these feelings back again, and by becoming familiar with these feelings, and by experiencing the empowerment that comes mysteriously whenever these feelings are honestly addressed, you go through this circle where people are screaming out their anguish and rage and terror about what it is that's happening, and you realise that everybody's feeling the same way because we're all living in the same world. We all understand, what's happening. And then afterwards, it's not that Joanna called it despair and empowerment. And it's not that you do the despair circle and then do an empowerment circle. It's that you find empowerment is what remains when the despair has honestly been accepted and we haven't run away from it. And so it's for that reason that Rising Tide, which is my favourite environmental organisation at the moment, Rising Tide, who organised the kayak blockade at the Hunter River in Newcastle of the world's largest coal port last November, where I was one of 109 arrested, my first arrest in 25 years. And they recognise this and have invited me and other facilitators of this work to do this with their activists, because it burnout proofs the activists. The depression turns into empowerment, and that depression and anxiety is an occupational hazard for people that are working on those front lines. So I just feel like that's a very important piece of this.
I just wanted to add, it was interesting what you're saying about acknowledging. If you acknowledge those feelings, what remains is empowerment. I think it probably does in the process that you've got. I don't necessarily think it does per se. And it sort of depends on how you go about it. And I've heard the distinction in the Buddhist world between what they call, word for feelings is Vedana, which is just what comes up unbidden, Vedana, and then what you then do with your state of mind, which is called Chaitana, which is more directionality of mind, that's more consciously directed. And you can't move your mind in a certain direction unless you acknowledge the underlying feelings first. But you also do need to add some sort of conscious cultivation to that. I think that's how I would look at it. And it sounds like that's exactly what you're doing in that process. the other thoughts that occurred to me was that, you know, one of the things that helps me stay like in the not knowing, is it too late? That question that keeps me sane is that one way of looking at that is that we, in the next few years, those of us who are alive now, might just be the most powerful people that ever get to live. So, damn it, I'm going to grab that opportunity and pull every lever I can, because some of them might be bigger than I think. And so, to me, it's a tremendously empowering moment. We kind of, we'll do things like we put like an archbishop from Brisbane in the room with the Prime Minister's chief of staff, and got to say to him back in February, if you invest heavily in renewables and clean energy and things like that, you'll at least bring places like Queensland with you. And you might actually, you might get like mainstream buy-in in a coal state. Now, of course, there's lots of flaws in that plan. A lot of other things have to be done to make everything right, not least stopping the bad stuff. But, and he was probably thinking about those things anyway for quite some time. But a month or two later, there's the Prime Minister announcing that's what he's going to do. We probably just nudged him in that direction. But having someone from Queensland who could say, look, my province goes all the way from central Queensland up to the Torres Strait and all over. And then the final thought on this is, I think there's a problem that we've got in the climate movement, which is endemic. I mentioned my friend Roland earlier. He said to me back in something like 96, 97, look, the problem that the climate movement has got is if you think about someone like Martin Luther King and his I Have a Dream speech, at the moment, we have no equivalent of that. We have no vision that we are trying to communicate. He said, what we're doing is we're telling the I Have a Nightmare speech. And it's so hard to get that right, but how do you acknowledge the potential for the nightmare and still communicate a dream? And, my dream is that we actually evolve as humans, as beings on this earth. And we evolve into a greater realization of non-separateness. That's the opportunity in front of us. And part of that, and that's not separate from being an activist. It's both. Anyway, I'll pass it back.
Can I suggest, Pauline, that soon we just invite a couple of people, and both from Zoom and from this room, to share something?
Yeah, certainly. So we're going to do that. Maybe the people I can see there's some people who've written things in the chat, have not been reading the chat. Hope there was nothing for us. But now we'll have to do that and give you a few moments to maybe put some observations, questions, comments in the chat. We will read them. And is there anybody in the room here that has got some observation to make? Carol?
I haven't followed it for a while, but I have, talking about compassion as an activist, Julian Assange is free. I'm going to cry because I've been working with the group. I know. I'm so excited. So that was why I was on. Jed Carney sent me a text. Her office manager sent me a text. I've got it here. I can read it for you. Can I read it? I'm so excited because the harder you work, the more you learn about yourself, the more strength you have to actually keep going. 13 years of imprisonment. You can do anything. You have so much power. I'm with you, boys. You have so much power. So Jed said, looks like Assange is finally free. She sent it twice because she didn't believe it probably. Albo and Penny reported. So then I got a message from Jason. We call him Jason, Jed's boy. He's just office manager, do anything for you. He said, because my mantra is I'm not free until Julian Assange is free. So he said, you are finally free as Julian is free. I said, I can't talk now. I'm in a deep ecology session. So I'm so excited. Do apologise because we've been working, for 13 years. And I just wanted to share that. So you can do anything together. Thank you. And to have a hug from John Shipton, may I say, is the hug that I've never had before. From a man who is dealing with his son in solitary confinement for how many years? 5 years, and talking with him and having lunch in Coburg not long ago. When that man gives you a hug, I've never been hugged like it before. It's something that I can't explain. So I'm always desperate to see him. And he just has his hands out. You know, it's like he's thankful, but he's also giving me something else that you might be able to explain. So, yeah, I'm a bit excited. Oh. We hope it's true. Yeah, thank you for letting me share that. Now I can have a rest from that.
Anyone else who would like to share before we resume people?
I've been going through a pessimistic phase for about 6 months or more. Oh, talking to those. Lately, I feel like I have trouble coping with my anger. Just there's just so many bad things happening. Most recent, Peter Dutton coming out with talking nuclear. Yeah. And I almost can't talk. I was with someone recently who said, well, you have to think these things through. You have to think about the pros and cons. Yeah. And I didn't like fly at her, but almost can't talk, you know. So, I hope so, but you don't know. You don't know. So I just I take on a lot about what you're saying about all the emotions you have and despair being in the same circle as empowerment, if you like. Yeah. But I just lately anger's my thing about like you said earlier, Pauline, you know, it's now 30 or 40 years ago that those of us who became aware of climate change and took it on board didn't just sort of, I think a lot of people just can shut it out or something. You know, and I probably spent the first 20 years feeling positive at times because, you know, we nearly brought in a carbon tax, you know, now about 20 years ago. But the last 10 years just seemed to be downhill, you know, and the fossil fuel industry got organised and I see it as they're beating us. They're miles ahead. And so, yeah, it's a combination of despair and anger that's hearing you talk about emotions and that's it. So,
do you mind if I respond to that briefly? I just respond to like that view that the fossil fuel industry is beating us and all of that. Look, changes. I'm still taking in the Julian Assange, but the change that has happened in the world in the last 10 years has been so massive in historical terms that if this were 20 or 25 years ago, we'd probably think we'd done enough to see off the worst. The problem is not the scale and pace of change. The problem, to my mind, is we've got so little time left. We're an incredible movement, an absolutely astonishing movement. We're still not at the scale and pace that we need to be. But our job is, I think, to keep building that movement. And I think I'm convinced that that's within reach. Whether we'll make it is a massive open question. But I don't think anything is given at this point. So I can see hands up all over the place. Someone else should facilitate.
Okay, so so Susie, would you like to unmute and talk?
Yes, thank you. Hi there. Hi, John. John's my neighbour here in the Eco Village in Narara. And I think Tejopala, I might have met you before. Also, I founded Parents for Climate and am on the board there. And I'm an Insight Dharma teacher. So the question I wanted to pose to both of you and raise, I think Gerald Freight also has put the similar question in the chat. So I'm just...
Sorry, Susie.
Yeah. Sorry, I can't hear what's being said. Should I?
Well, sorry.
What's going on?
Oh, okay. We're having. I could probably talk to this one as well. We're having IT issues with the sound, so that's we can't hear you without hearing something that John had on his computer going. So we're going to definitely need you to write something into the chat, if you would. I will get my beautiful assistant Katrina here, who has only now joined the Zoom, so she hasn't been able to see anything else in the chat that had been previous to now. So if you would please write your question into the chat, then we'll have to do it that way. To give you a few minutes for that, we will maybe go to Bron and give you the opportunity to ask your question.
One of them.
Everybody there? I wanted to start with riffing on the word truth. I want to also acknowledge how beautiful it is to be here and yeah, just be in this space and hear all that you have to say. First half of my life, I lived under a rock. Second half, I've been an activist. My spirituality level was down here. I don't know where it is now, but from an ecological level, I think it's sort of up here. Spent a long time in activism, but feel now I'm sort of an old cow in the paddock of activism. Many of us have mentioned the sort of 30-odd years of what have we achieved. And I like to reflect back on when I first learned about global warming 30-odd years ago, 30, 40. And I know through reading a book by a woman called Maria Taylor, entitled What Australia Knew and Buried, that we were a very well-informed community and population back then, back in the late 80s, early 90s, on climate, on global warming. We're not now. And what has changed? And what has changed is our ability to believe rather than to know the truth. I think that points to media, politics, right-wing think tanks. If I can just throw that out there, that's been mulling away with me since I've been here. Thank you.
Sorry, Susie, I don't know that we're going to be able to work that out. I'd like to respond to that and say that, yeah, so that last night I'm giving half a dozen talks here in Melbourne during this week, and last night I gave a talk called The Religion of Economics, sort of defrocking that false religion of with the premise that infinite growth is possible on a finite planet and so on. But the reason that I did so, I did the research for a chapter in a book 15 years ago on that subject. But the reason that I dusted all of that off was because I've been learning about the funding of those think tanks, that there are 500 or 600 think tanks organised by a group called the Atlas Foundation, and $800 million a year from Exxon, Shell, Mobil, the mining companies, Gina Rinehart, Rupert Murdoch, you name it, all the scumbags are funding it. And the purpose is to pollute the information landscape and make it sound as if there is controversy when in fact we have the greatest consensus that science has ever known. And they wish to be able to keep their profits pouring through at this point, and they do so by making sure that we can't understand what's going on. They they'll find a scientist in some other field who has some wacky opinion, and they will get him published in journals all over the place. It's just like the most, and they're using the PR companies that were kept tobacco going for decades after its use-by date. And so I feel like knowing about the Atlas Foundation, in particular, I'd recommend that people look at a webinar that Scott Ludlam, the ex-deputy leader of the Greens, put together, where in an hour and a half you will be shocked to your core to learn about how we're being deceived deliberately by these groups. And I think that that's the reason for what you've said.
And I think that the nuclear debate is another diversion that's taking oxygen out of our activism, our messaging. What do we do with it? I think that what came out of that webinar is expose this network for what it is, rather than try and fight them on what they want to talk about. That's a tall order.
So Susie's question, thank you for bearing with us. How can we mainstream the practices of facing and healing our emotions about the climate and of realizing our independence? Can we create mainstream rituals? And which I was actually wondering about how we can, in the Buddha Dharma Sangha, how we can cultivate the Sangha was also interesting.
Well, there's a lot of things that come to mind. How do you do it? I don't know if I've got any kind of a plan as such. I've thought about it. Probably the best I've ever come across who would be appeal to people from a lot of faith traditions and draw on a number of them is an American psychologist called Marshall Rosenberg, who founded a process known as nonviolent communication. I really hope that his work, which is both transforming the way that we communicate, but also transforming our minds, I really hope that that can be brought into the climate movement more generally. There's a fantastic video there's lots of videos of him on YouTube. There's one that's about 10 minutes long, which starts with him being he recounts the story of when he was brought in to give a talk about his process at a Palestinian refugee camp. And within about the first minute, someone was yelling at him. He's Jewish and American, right? And the first minute, someone was yelling at him that he was a murderer. And he was able to empathize with that person, not tell them they were wrong or anything like that, but empathize with where they were coming from. to the point where he was welcomed home back to that gentleman's place for dinner that night, and where they ended up setting up nonviolent communication schools in refugee camps. And so I have an awful lot of respect for Marshall Rosenberg. And I guess, you know, I would also hope that we can mainstream some sort of meditation protest. That's the other thing that I think is incredibly powerful. The images of people sitting in meditation to blockade, but actually not just doing it symbolically, not just as a piece of theatre, but actually trying to cultivate compassion. And I know that there have been people, particularly in the UK, particularly in the Extinction Rebellion movement, who've done that to great effect. So I think those are my best shots I've got now.
Would you like to?
Well, I don't have much to add. I'm excited by what you've shared, but what I will say is that I've been doing the same workshop for nearly 40 years now. It doesn't change very much because I think we got it right early on, and but what's changed is that for the longest time, the only people that came along were hippies and pagans and witches, and this year, there have been senators and university professors and tons of psychologists and counselors and so on. So, I mean, that's just one tiny window into this vast arena, but that's really all that I can speak to. But good question, Susie.
So I'm noticing it's nearly 12 o'clock. So I'm wondering if that we are beginning to wrap up. Would you care to make us a wrapping up process? Thoughts?
Well, maybe I'll wrap up first by saying how delighted I am to meet you, Tejopala, and how I feel as though I've just had a chiropractic adjustment or something like that, listening to your positive energy, and I look forward to learning more about your work.
Gosh, thank you. Some Buddhist communities have got a practice they call the transference of merits. Which is to say, whatever positive effect that may have come from whatever I've just been doing, may that be accrued to all sentient beings. And it comes from a text that the Dalai Lama rates as his favorite text, called the Bodhicharya Avatara, the Bodhisattva's way of life. And in which the main teaching is to say, look, shift your primary emphasis away from your life being about yourself to your life being about beings. I'll just, if I may, just as a ritual to close, it's usually said, one says it oneself and others can join in if you want. So I'll just say it for me, and you can sit, and if this means something to you in your own mind, then, can participate silently, but it goes like this. May the merit gained in my acting thus go to the alleviation of the suffering of all beings. My personality throughout my existences, my possessions, and my merit in all three ways, I give up without regard to myself, for the benefit of all beings. Just as the earth and other elements are serviceable in many ways to the infinite number of beings inhabiting limitless space, so may I become that which maintains all beings situated throughout space, so long as all have not attained to peace.
Thank you both for, dare I say, enlightening conversation. And I understand, John, that so anybody who has joined in on the link will be part of that, was so that you can then be in recipient of John's further emails, and I hope to see some of you on the path in the future, and may we come to a future that is actually conducive to the the flowering of life on Earth, ecozoic, that's my favorite word. Thank you, Thomas Berry. The situations that are conducive to life rather than the world that we are at the moment, which is exploitative of life. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time, and bye.
Welcome to the Rainforest Information Centre, protecting rainforests in partnership with Indigenous communities and local people to safeguard these vital ecosystems. Join our mission to protect rainforests. Your support makes a difference. Don't miss out on the opportunity to learn more about our work. Help us save the Earth's remaining rainforests. Visit JohnSeed.net today.
Ecosystem after system is plundered and laid to waste us from the earth. He sucks the life